Welcome, wanderer of the four nations, to the twilight chapter of Avatar Aang's extraordinary journey. Tonight, we explore the final decades of the last airbender's life. Not the dramatic battles of his youth, but the quieter, deeper challenges of legacy, family, and the gradual transition from savior to elder. This is the story of how a boy who once saved the world learned to live within it, how the avatar who mastered all elements faced his greatest test, time itself. Settle in as we traverse these gentle years of wisdom, reflection, and the peaceful preparation for an eternal cycle's continuation. The silence that settled over the world in the aftermath of Sozin's comet was unlike anything Aang had ever experienced. A quiet so profound it seemed to echo with the weight of everything that had changed in those final moments, when fire and fury gave way to mercy and restored balance. The boy who had awakened from ice just months before had become something different during that climactic confrontation, not through the dramatic transformation that others might have expected, but through the subtle shift that comes when someone discovers they can hold firm to their deepest principles, even when the entire world seems to demand their abandonment. The days immediately following Fire Lord Ozai's defeat were filled with celebration and chaos in equal measure, as news of the war's end spread across continents that had known nothing but conflict for longer than most people could remember their own names. Cities that had cowered behind walls for generations opened their gates to let sunlight reach streets that had been shadowed by fear, while villages that had hidden their children from Fire Nation patrols finally allowed laughter to ring through air that had been thick with smoke and terror for decades beyond counting. But for Aang, the victory felt strangely hollow, not because he doubted the righteousness of his cause or the necessity of stopping Ozai's genocidal ambitions, but because the magnitude of what lay ahead seemed even more daunting than the battles that had brought him to this moment of triumph. Ending the war had required courage, skill, and the willingness to risk everything in service of principles that transcended personal survival. But building peace would demand different virtues entirely, qualities that his air nomad upbringing had emphasized, but that he had never been forced to apply on such a comprehensive scale. The immediate practical challenges were overwhelming in their scope and complexity, touching every aspect of how the four nations related to each other, and how millions of individual lives would need to be rebuilt from the ruins that a century of warfare had created. Fire Nation occupation forces needed to be withdrawn from conquered territories, but the process required careful coordination to prevent power vacuums that might lead to civil wars or banditry that could make conditions worse for ordinary people who had already suffered more than any generation should have to endure. The prisoners of war who filled Fire Nation detention facilities throughout the occupied territories represented not just a logistical challenge, but a moral test of whether the peace that was being constructed would embody the principles of justice and reconciliation that had motivated the struggle against tyranny. Some of these captives were clearly victims of circumstance, conscripted soldiers who had fought reluctantly in service of policies they privately opposed, while others had enthusiastically participated in atrocities that demanded accountability if the new order was to have any moral credibility. The refugee populations that had been displaced by the war's violence numbered in the millions, their temporary camps having evolved into permanent settlements as years of conflict stretched into decades of despair. These communities had developed their own customs and leadership structures during their exile, creating bonds that complicated simple repatriation, while also demonstrating the resilience and adaptability that would be essential for reconstruction efforts throughout the affected regions. The economic disruption that the war had created touched every aspect of how societies functioned, from trade networks that had been severed by military action to agricultural systems that had been devastated by scorched earth tactics designed to deny resources to enemy forces. The Fire Nation's industrial capacity had been devoted to military production for so long that converting it to peaceful purposes would require fundamental restructuring of entire economic sectors, while the other nations needed to rebuild infrastructure that had been systematically destroyed during decades of occupation and resistance warfare. Aang's role in addressing these challenges was complicated by the fact that his authority derived from spiritual rather than political sources, making him influential, but not directly responsible for the administrative decisions that would determine whether peace could be sustained or would collapse under the weight of unresolved grievances and competing interests. The Avatar was meant to be a bridge between worlds and a guardian of balance, but translating those cosmic responsibilities into practical policies required skills that his education at the air temples had not specifically prepared him to exercise effectively. The relationship with Fire Lord Zuko that would become central to reconstruction efforts began during these early weeks, with conversations that were awkward and tentative, both participants aware that their previous interactions had been shaped by circumstances that no longer applied, but uncertain about how to build trust when so much history stood between them. Zuko's commitment to making amends for his nation's crimes was clearly genuine, but his authority within his own government was still fragile, dependent on support from military leaders and court officials who had spent their entire careers serving the imperial system that the new Fire Lord was attempting to reform. The complexity of Zuko's domestic political situation became apparent as reports reached Aang about resistance to the young Fire Lord's policies from various factions within Fire Nation society who had benefited from the war, economy, and saw peace as a threat to their privileged positions. Some of this opposition was ideological, reflecting genuine belief that Fire Nation's superiority justified continued expansion and dominance over other peoples, while other resistance was purely economic, driven by fears that ending military production and colonial exploitation would reduce living standards for Fire Nation citizens who had grown accustomed to prosperity built on others' suffering. The colonial territories that the Fire Nation had established throughout the Earth Kingdom presented particularly thorny challenges because their populations had developed complex identities during decades of occupation, with many families, including members from both nations, who had built lives that transcended the political boundaries that the war had supposedly been fighting to preserve or restore. The simple solution of returning all occupied lands to Earth Kingdom control ignored the reality that these communities had evolved their own cultures and interests that might not be well served by either traditional, national authority. The Earth Kingdom's internal political situation was equally complicated, with King Kuei's authority having been undermined by years of military defeats and the revelation that his government had been manipulated by the Dai Li conspiracy that had prioritized maintaining power over serving the people's broad, actual needs. The various Earth Kingdom generals who had led resistance efforts during the occupation had developed their own power bases and policy priorities that did not always align with the king's preferences or with each other's strategic objectives. The water tribes had emerged from the war in relatively better condition than the other nations, but their smaller populations and limited industrial capacity meant that their influence over reconstruction policies would be constrained, despite their moral authority as victims of Fire Nation aggression. The Southern Water Tribe's devastation was particularly severe, with its water-bending population having been eliminated through systematic raids that had targeted not just individuals, but the cultural knowledge that made their society distinctive and valuable. Aang's personal adjustment to peacetime responsibilities was complicated by psychological factors that he was only beginning to understand. The transition from constant physical danger to relative safety creating space for emotional reactions that had been suppressed during the crisis period when survival required focusing entirely on immediate threats. The nightmares that began during these weeks were filled not with memories of battles he had fought, but with visions of possibilities that might have been alternative outcomes, where his choices had led to greater suffering, or where his commitment to air nomad principles had proven inadequate for protecting the people who depended on his success. The loneliness that had always been part of Aang's experience as the last airbender became more acute during peacetime because the constant activity and shared danger of the war years had provided distraction from the fundamental isolation that came with being the only survivor of his people. The friends who had supported him through the most dangerous period of his life were beginning to pursue their own interests and relationships, creating natural distance that felt like abandonment, even though everyone involved understood that such separation was healthy and inevitable. The relationship with Katara that had sustained Aang through his most difficult moments was evolving in ways that brought both happiness and uncertainty. Their romantic attachment deepening even as the practical challenges of building a future together seemed increasingly complex. The cultural differences between air nomad and water tribe traditions created questions about how their eventual marriage might be conducted and where their children might be raised, while their different approaches to dealing with conflict and change sometimes led to misunderstandings that required patience and communication to resolve satisfactorily. The air temples that had been Aang's childhood homes were being gradually restored through efforts that combined his personal memories with archaeological evidence and the assistance of craftsmen from all four nations who volunteered their skills in recognition of what the air nomads had contributed to the world's spiritual and cultural heritage. But each visit to these sacred sites brought fresh reminders of everything that had been lost. The silence where voices should have been echoing, and the emptiness where communities should have been thriving, according to patterns established across centuries of peaceful continuity. The flying bison that had survived the genocide in hidden refuges were being carefully located and protected, their numbers still critically small, but their existence offering hope that other elements of air nomad culture might have endured in forms that could be discovered and preserved with sufficient dedication and resources. Each new bison that was found represented not just biological diversity but cultural continuity, living connections to the world that had existed before the war, transformed everything through violence and loss that could never be fully quantified or understood. The spiritual dimensions of Aang's recovery from the war's trauma required practices that had been central to air nomad life, but that were difficult to maintain without the community context that had given them meaning and effectiveness. The meditation techniques that had once brought him peace and clarity now sometimes triggered memories of the avatar state experiences that had been necessary for survival, but that had also exposed him to cosmic forces beyond his complete understanding or control. The dreams that came to him during this period often featured conversations with Avatar Roku and other previous incarnations, who offered guidance about the challenges of transitioning from wartime to peacetime leadership. Their advice, emphasizing patience and understanding while warning about the temptation to use avatar power to solve problems that required slower, more collaborative approaches to achieve lasting resolution. These spiritual mentors reminded him that the avatar's role was to maintain balance rather than to impose solutions, to facilitate cooperation rather than to dictate outcomes according to personal preferences or immediate convenience. The administrative skills that peace required were different from the combat abilities that had served during the war, demanding patience with bureaucratic processes and willingness to accept compromise solutions that satisfied no one completely, while serving everyone's essential needs better than more dramatic alternatives that might have been emotionally satisfying but practically destructive. The negotiations between former enemies required him to remain neutral while encouraging all parties to consider long-term consequences rather than focusing exclusively on immediate advantages or historical grievances. The economic reconstruction that was beginning throughout the war-torn regions created opportunities for innovation and cooperation that had been impossible during the conflict period, but also generated new forms of inequality and competition that required careful management to prevent them from becoming sources of future instability. The Fire Nation's advanced technology could contribute to everyone's prosperity if properly shared, but the process of technology transfer needed to be managed in ways that strengthened rather than undermined the receiving nation's autonomy and cultural integrity. The international law that was being developed to govern relations between nations in the post-war period required precedents and principles that had no clear historical basis, forcing all parties to experiment with new forms of diplomacy and conflict resolution that reflected the changed circumstances created by a century of total warfare, followed by comprehensive defeat of the aggressor nation. The Avatar's role in this process was both crucial and delicate, providing moral authority while avoiding the appearance of imposing air nomad values on societies with different traditions and priorities. The young man who emerged from these months of intense learning and adaptation was recognizably the same person who had awakened from ice with innocence intact, but the experiences of ending the war and beginning the peace had added layers of understanding and capability that would serve him throughout the decades of responsibility that lay ahead. The boy who had once run from Avatar duties had grown into someone who could embrace them without losing sight of the human connections and simple joys that made such cosmic responsibility bearable and meaningful. As the immediate crisis period gave way to the longer-term work of reconstruction, Aang began to understand that his greatest contributions to the world's healing would come not from dramatic interventions, but from the patient daily work of building relationships, preserving knowledge, and creating institutions that could maintain peace through cooperation rather than domination. The Avatar who had saved the world through mercy was learning to serve it through wisdom, one carefully considered decision at a time. The vision that would become Republic City first took shape not in grand council chambers or elaborate architectural drawings, but in quiet conversations between two young men who had learned that the most profound changes often begin with simple recognition that old ways of thinking are inadequate for new realities. Aang and Zuko's discussions during those early months of peace frequently returned to the same troubling observation. The traditional boundaries between nations, which had once seemed natural and permanent, had been revealed by the war's devastation to be artificial constructs that served political convenience more than human flourishing or practical necessity. The Fire Nation colonies scattered throughout Earth Kingdom territory had become more than mere military outposts during their decades of existence, evolving into communities where people from different nations had built lives together, raised children who belonged fully to neither parent culture, and created new forms of social organization that reflected their unique circumstances rather than simply replicating the traditions they had inherited from distant homelands that felt increasingly irrelevant to their daily concerns and immediate needs. Yudao, the oldest and largest of these colonial settlements, represented both the problem and the potential solution in its most concentrated form. The city's streets were living testimony to how cultures could blend and strengthen each other when political barriers proved less important than practical cooperation and personal affection. Its architecture, combining Fire Nation engineering with Earth Kingdom materials, while its markets offered foods and crafts that drew from multiple traditions without belonging completely to any single one. The Harmony Restoration Movement's initial plan to eliminate all Fire Nation presence from Earth Kingdom territory seemed logical and just from the perspective of traditional international law. but its implementation would have required the forced separation of families and the destruction of communities that had committed no crimes beyond existing in defiance of neat political categories. The human cost of such restoration would have created new forms of suffering to replace those that the war had inflicted, perpetuating cycles of displacement and loss that peace was supposed to heal rather than perpetuate. The crisis that erupted when Earth Kingdom forces moved to enforce colonial removal orders demonstrated how quickly good intentions could produce disastrous consequences when policy decisions ignored the complex realities that had developed during decades of unprecedented historical change. The sight of soldiers preparing to tear apart families who considered themselves loyal citizens of communities they had helped build challenged every assumption about justice, sovereignty, and the proper relationship between individual rights and collective political objectives that governments claim to serve. Aang's intervention to prevent the Battle of Yudao required him to take positions that pleased no one completely, while trying to preserve relationships that rigid adherence to principle would have destroyed permanently. His decision to protect the colonists from forced removal disappointed Earth Kingdom leaders who had expected Avatar support for their legitimate sovereignty claims, while his refusal to endorse permanent Fire Nation control frustrated those who wanted clear victory rather than ambiguous compromise that left fundamental questions unresolved. The solution that eventually emerged from months of difficult negotiations required all parties to abandon positions they had considered non-negotiable, accepting outcomes that provided partial satisfaction rather than complete vindication of their respective principles and grievances. The transformation of the oldest colonies into autonomous regions that owed allegiance to neither the Fire Nation nor the Earth Kingdom created precedents for new forms of political organization that acknowledged realities existing. National boundaries could not accommodate without doing violence to the people whose lives they were meant to serve. The United Republic of Nations that grew from this colonial compromise represented revolutionary thinking about how political authority could be organized to serve populations whose identities transcended traditional cultural categories, while providing them with institutions capable of protecting their interests and facilitating their continued development as distinctive communities. The new nation would be governed by representatives from all backgrounds, rather than dominated by any single group, creating frameworks for cooperation that reflected the colonial experience of successful multicultural collaboration. The selection of Cranefish Town as the site for the United Republic's capital was driven by practical considerations about location and existing infrastructure, but the decision also carried symbolic weight that would influence how the new city understood its role as a model for international cooperation and cultural synthesis. The town's position on the coast provided access to ocean trade routes that could connect all four nations economically, while its relatively modest size offered opportunities for planned development that could incorporate the best features of each nation's architectural and urban planning traditions. The early phases of Republic City's construction required unprecedented cooperation between craftsmen, engineers, and architects from backgrounds that had been trained to see each other as enemies, their collaboration producing buildings and public spaces that combined different approaches to design and construction in ways that created something entirely new while honoring all the traditions that had contributed to its creation. The Fire Lord's industrial expertise merged with earthbender engineering skills and waterbender understanding of fluid dynamics to produce infrastructure that was both beautiful and functional, demonstrating how diversity could become strength when properly channeled toward common objectives. The population that began gathering in the emerging city represented the full spectrum of post-war humanity, from former soldiers seeking new purposes to merchants hoping to profit from expanded trade opportunities, to families looking for places where their children could grow up. without being defined primarily by their national origins or elemental abilities. The mixing of these diverse groups created social dynamics that were sometimes challenging but always fascinating, requiring new forms of governance and community organization that could accommodate differences while maintaining order and justice. The legal system that developed to serve this multicultural population needed to synthesize elements from all four nations' traditional approaches to justice while creating new procedures for handling conflicts that arose from cultural misunderstandings or competing interpretations of rights and responsibilities. The courts that were established reflected compromise and adaptation, rather than the dominance of any single legal tradition, their decisions setting precedents that would influence how other diverse communities addressed similar challenges in future years. The economic opportunities that Republic City's unique position created attracted investment and entrepreneurship from throughout the world, generating wealth that elevated living standards, while also creating new forms of inequality that required careful management to prevent them from undermining the social cohesion that made the city's multicultural experiment possible. The success of businesses that drew on multiple cultural traditions for their products and services demonstrated how cooperation could produce benefits that competition and isolation could never achieve. Air Temple Island's establishment as both Aang's home and a center for air nomad cultural preservation created a visible symbol of how tradition could survive and adapt without losing its essential character or spiritual significance. The island's location near the heart of Republic City emphasized that spiritual values had legitimate places in modern urban life, while its function as a sanctuary for flying bison and other survivors from the pre-war world demonstrated commitment to preserving what could be saved from the past, while building something new and better for the future that was taking shape around them. The architecture that rose on Air Temple Island combined traditional air nomad design principles with materials and techniques that reflected the island's contemporary context and practical needs, creating buildings that felt authentically connected to ancient traditions while serving modern purposes that the original designers could never have anticipated. The meditation halls and libraries that were constructed provided spaces for spiritual practice and study that honored the past while remaining accessible to people from backgrounds that had not prepared them for the specific requirements of air nomad religious and philosophical traditions. The gardens that were planted throughout the island attempted to recreate the agricultural and botanical environments that had supported air nomad communities before the genocide. But many of the original plant varieties were extinct and had to be replaced with substitutes that served similar functions while creating new relationships between the community and its natural surroundings. The compromises that were necessary sometimes felt like betrayals of authentic tradition, but they were essential for creating living spaces that could sustain contemporary residents while preserving whatever remained of ancient wisdom and practice. The flying bison that found their way to the island during these early years represented hope that life could recover from even the most devastating losses when conditions were right and people were willing to provide the protection and support that survival required. Each new bison that arrived was celebrated as victory over extinction, proof that dedication and patience could accomplish what force and political maneuvering could never achieve, while their presence provided living connections to the world that had existed before war transformed everything through violence and destruction. The ring-tailed winged lemurs that had evolved from their pre-war ancestors during Aang's century of absence showed how adaptation and change could preserve essential characteristics while developing new capabilities that served survival in altered circumstances that demanded flexibility rather than rigid adherence to previous patterns. Their playful nature remained unchanged despite their modified appearance, their social bonds still centered around mutual grooming and shared exploration of their environment, their delight in aerial acrobatics, undiminished by genetic modifications that evolution had imposed during the long years when no one was available to protect them from natural selection's pressures. The Air acolytes who came to study on the island brought enthusiasm and dedication that sometimes exceeded their understanding of the philosophical principles underlying the practices they worked so hard to master correctly. Their mistakes and successes in learning meditation techniques, dietary restrictions, and spiritual exercises that had been second nature to people raised within air nomad culture provided Aang with insights into how traditions could be transmitted across cultural boundaries while maintaining their essential meaning and effectiveness despite the inevitable modifications that such transmission required. The marriage ceremony that united Aang and Katara was conducted according to traditions that honored both their individual heritages while creating something new that reflected their shared experiences and common commitments to building futures worthy of the sacrifices that had been made to make peace possible. The vows they exchanged carried weight that went beyond personal promises to encompass their dedication to serving the greater good, while maintaining the love and trust that had sustained them through the war's darkest moments, and Des would need to continue sustaining them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The honeymoon that followed provided them with their first extended period of privacy and relaxation since the war's end. Time together, without the constant pressure of crisis management and public responsibility that had defined their relationship throughout the most intense period of their young lives. The simple pleasures of uninterrupted conversation, shared meals, and peaceful sleep felt almost miraculous after years when such ordinary joys had been impossible luxuries that survival had forced them to sacrifice for the greater good that their individual happiness had served. The early months of their marriage established patterns of mutual support and shared decision-making that would need to sustain them through decades of avatar responsibility and the challenges of raising children who would inherit legacies that were both precious and burdensome. Katara's strength and wisdom complemented Aang's spiritual insights and elemental abilities, their partnership creating capabilities that exceeded what either could have accomplished independently, while preserving the individual identities that made their love authentic rather than simply convenient. The restoration work that began at the 4 air temples during this period required balancing historical accuracy with practical necessity, recreating buildings and facilities that could serve contemporary needs, while honoring the architectural principles and aesthetic values that had made the original temples both beautiful and functional centers of spiritual life. Cultural preservation. Decision about materials, design, and purpose demanded careful consideration of how modern requirements could be accommodated without compromising the essential character that made these places sacred rather than merely useful. The library collections that were assembled through careful gathering and preservation of surviving air nomad texts created resources that future students could use to understand the philosophical and practical foundations of the culture Aang was working to preserve and transmit to people whose backgrounds had not prepared them for its requirements and rewards. But the gaps in these collections were enormous. Entire areas of knowledge represented only by fragmentary references that hinted at sophisticated understanding that had been lost forever when the genocide eliminated the people who had carried such wisdom in their memories and daily practices. The agricultural experiments that were conducted at each restored temple site attempted to recreate the food production systems that had sustained air nomad communities through centuries of peaceful existence in harmony with their mountain environments. But many of the plant varieties that had been cultivated by his people were extinct and had to be replaced with substitutes that changed not just flavors, but the entire relationship between the communities and their natural surroundings. The modifications that were necessary altered practices that had been central to air nomad spirituality, forcing adaptations that preserved function while losing some of the cultural significance that had made these activities meaningful beyond their practical utility. The success of Republic City, as a model for international cooperation and cultural synthesis, provided evidence that the vision underlying the United Republic was achievable in practice, rather than merely serving as noble aspiration that reality would eventually defeat through the inevitable conflicts that diversity was supposed to create according to conventional wisdom. The city's prosperity and social harmony demonstrated that differences could become sources of strength rather than division, when institutions were designed to accommodate rather than suppress the variety that made communities dynamic and creative. As the city grew and its influence spread throughout the region, Aang began to understand that his greatest contribution to the world's healing might not be the dramatic interventions that had ended the war, but the patient daily work of building institutions and preserving knowledge that could maintain peace through cooperation rather than the dominance that had characterized international relations for too many generations before his intervention had made different approaches possible and practical for the first time in living memory. The birth of Bhumi in the spring of Aang's 28th year brought joy that seemed to illuminate every corner of Air Temple Island with light that had been absent from the world since before the genocide transformed the Sambal. Avatar's existence from blessed calling to lonely burden. The healthy cries that echoed through halls designed for meditation and quiet contemplation announced not just the arrival of a new soul, but the beginning of a family legacy that would carry forward elements of both air nomad and water tribe heritage while creating something entirely new that belonged fully to the post-war world and its possibilities. The name they chose honored King Bhumi of Omashu, whose eccentric wisdom and century-long friendship had demonstrated that true strength lay not in rigid adherence to conventional thinking, but in the creative flexibility that could find unexpected solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The hope embedded in this naming was that their son would develop similar qualities of insight and adaptability, the kind of intelligence that could navigate complexities without losing sight of essential truths or abandoning principles for convenience when circumstances became difficult or confusing. But the happiness that surrounded Bhumi's arrival was complicated by the gradual recognition that he showed no signs of bending ability, his interaction with the elements remaining entirely ordinary, despite his father's mastery of all four and his mother's exceptional waterbending skills. The absence of elemental manipulation in their firstborn created no disappointment in parents who understood that worth had nothing to do with bending capacity. But it did raise questions about the future of air nomad culture and the practical challenges of preserving traditions that were intimately connected to airbending techniques and philosophies. The pressure that Aang felt to ensure the continuation of his people's legacy through his children was intensified by the knowledge that he might be the only person alive who possessed complete understanding of air nomad spiritual practice, méditation technique, and the subtle philosophical frameworks that had made their society distinctive among the four nations. The weight of cultural preservation that rested on his shoulders felt enormous when contemplated in relation to children who might or might not inherit the abilities necessary to fully appreciate or transmit what he had learned during his Bodhas. Childhood among people who were now nothing more than memories and carefully preserved artifacts. The daily routines of caring for an infant provided Aang with experiences that his education at the air temples had not prepared him to handle. The constant demands for attention and the sleepless nights creating pressures that were different from, but no less challenging than the cosmic responsibilities that came with being the Avatar. The simple tasks of feeding, bathing, and soothing A baby required patience and presence that were difficult to maintain when urgent messages arrived about international crises that only he could resolve effectively, creating tensions between personal obligations and global duties that had no clear resolution. Katara's natural competence as a mother complemented her healing abilities and teaching experience in ways that made the early months of parenthood manageable, despite the challenges that any new family faces when learning to integrate another person's needs into established patterns of daily life. Her water tribe upbringing had provided her with practical knowledge about childcare that air nomad bachelor monks had not traditionally possessed, while her own experience of growing up without a mother had taught her the importance of consistent presence and emotional availability that children require for healthy development. The birth of Kia 3 years later brought different dynamics to their growing family, while demonstrating that each child would develop according to individual temperament and abilities, rather than simply fulfilling parental expectations or cultural requirements. The daughter who bore her grandmother's name showed early signs of waterbending ability that manifested through unconscious manipulation of bath water and drinking cups. Her natural talent requiring guidance and structure to develop safely while creating opportunities for bonding with her mother that her older brother could not share in quite the same way. The joy that Katara experienced in teaching her daughter the fundamentals of waterbending was balanced by careful attention to Bumi's emotional needs and his potential feelings of exclusion from activities that required elemental abilities he did not possess. The family dynamics that began developing during this period established patterns that would persist throughout their children's development, with each parent working to ensure that all children received equal love and attention, while acknowledging that their different capabilities would require different forms of guidance and support throughout their growth toward adulthood. Kia's waterbending abilities created possibilities for her to connect with her mother's cultural heritage in ways that went beyond simple family stories or occasional visits to the Southern Water Tribe, her elemental mastery providing access to traditions and practices that were central to Water Tribe identity and spiritual life. The forms and techniques that she learned carried not just practical applications, but cultural significance that linked her to generations of women who had used similar abilities in service of their communities and families, creating continuity that transcended the disruptions that war had imposed on normal patterns of cultural transmission. The birth of Tenzin 7 years after his sister's arrival completed their family while creating new pressures and expectations that none of the previous children had been forced to bear from their earliest moments of consciousness. The signs of airbending ability that manifested in their youngest son almost immediately were greeted with relief and excitement that were difficult to separate from the broader implications of what his elemental mastery might mean for the preservation of air nomad culture and the continuation of traditions that had seemed destined for extinction despite all efforts at preservation through non-airbending students and careful documentation. The intensity of instruction that Aang provided to Tenzin from his earliest years reflected not impatience with normal childhood development, but desperate awareness that he might be the last person capable of transmitting knowledge that would otherwise disappear forever when death claimed the final survivor of the air nomad genocide. The techniques, philosophies, and spiritual practices that had been second nature to people raised within the culture required deliberate teaching and patient repetition when passed to someone whose early experiences had not prepared him to receive them as naturally as breathing or walking. The airbending lessons that began when Tenzin was barely old enough to walk were carefully designed to feel like play rather than formal education, incorporating games and activities that would develop both physical coordination and the mental attitudes that effective elemental manipulation required. while preserving the joy and creativity that air nomad culture had always emphasized as essential components of spiritual development. The air scooter techniques that had once been Aang's personal innovation became foundational exercises that demonstrated how traditional principles could generate new applications when approached with the right combination of understanding and imagination. But the focus on Tenzin's airbending education inevitably created situations where his siblings felt less important or valued, their own achievements and interests sometimes receiving less attention than they deserved, because their father's emotional energy was concentrated on the child who carried the future of their extinct culture within his developing abilities. The family trips to air temples for cultural education were wonderful opportunities for shared experiences, but they also emphasized how much of the instruction was directed specifically toward the one child who could fully participate in the airbending demonstrations and philosophical discussions that were central to these educational journeys. Bumi's feelings of exclusion during family activities that focused on elemental abilities or air nomad cultural practices reflected broader questions about identity and belonging that mixed families throughout the post-war world were struggling to address in their own ways. His father's heritage was rich and meaningful, but it was also something he could not completely inherit or share, making him feel like an observer rather than participant in traditions that seemed to matter more to his parents than his own interests and capabilities that had nothing to do with bending but were no less worthy of recognition and encouragement. The stories that Aang told during bedtime routines attempted to preserve air nomad oral traditions while adapting them for young audiences who needed to understand their cultural heritage without being overwhelmed by the tragic circumstances that had made such preservation necessary and urgent. The tales of previous avatars, ancient spirits, and the philosophical principles that had guided air nomad society were modified to emphasize hope and possibility rather than dwelling on loss and destruction that could create anxiety rather than inspiration in children who were trying to understand their place in family and world that had been shaped by events beyond their control or comprehension. The meditation practices that Aang taught all three children were simplified and adapted to accommodate different ages and attention spans, while preserving the essential techniques that had been central to air nomads' spiritual development. For centuries before the war, eliminated the communities where such knowledge had been transmitted naturally from one generation to the next. The breathing exercises and mindfulness activities that worked well for Tenzin sometimes proved challenging for his siblings, whose different temperaments and abilities required alternative approaches that honored the same underlying principles while adapting to individual needs and preferences. The ethical instruction that accompanied all aspects of their education emphasized the air nomad commitment to preserving life and avoiding unnecessary harm to any conscious being. But these principles sometimes created confusion for children who were trying to understand how such beliefs applied to practical situations that seemed to require choices between competing values or interests. The vegetarian lifestyle that was central to air nomad culture was easy enough to maintain within their household, but explaining why it mattered required philosophical discussions that were challenging for young minds, still developing their capacity for abstract reasoning and moral judgment. The relationship between Aang's parenting responsibilities and his avatar duties became increasingly complex as the children grew older and required more attention, while the world continued to present crises that demanded immediate intervention from the only person capable of mediating between spiritual and political realms. The guilt that he felt over missing important moments in his children's lives due to emergency missions was balanced by recognition that the peace and stability he worked to maintain were essential for giving them the kind of future that made personal happiness possible in the first place. Katara's role in managing these competing demands required her to serve as both primary parent and avatar support system, ensuring that the children's needs were met, while also providing Aang with the emotional stability and practical assistance that his cosmic responsibilities required for effective fulfillment. Her strength in handling these multiple roles made their family life possible, while sometimes leaving her own individual needs and interests subordinated to everyone else's requirements, a sacrifice that she made willingly, but that created pressures of its own that needed acknowledgement and accommodation when possible. The financial security that came from Aang's status and the economic opportunities that Republic City provided allowed their family to live comfortably while pursuing interests and activities that would have been impossible for ordinary citizens struggling with the basic necessities of survival in a world still recovering from war's devastation. The privilege that this represented came with responsibilities to use their advantages in service of others who had not been as fortunate, lessons that were important for their children to learn, even when the teaching sometimes felt burdensome or uncomfortable. The social isolation that came from being the Avatar's family was particularly challenging for the children, who found themselves treated differently by other young people, who either viewed them with awe or resentment, depending on their own family circumstances and political perspectives. The normal friendships and casual social interactions that were essential for healthy development required careful management to ensure that the children could form genuine relationships without being defined primarily by their pace, father's cosmic role, or their family's unusual position in post-war society. The legacy that Aang hoped to leave his children went beyond air nomad culture or avatar powers to encompass values and principles that could guide their lives regardless of their individual abilities or the specific challenges they would face in a world that was still determining what peace would look like when fully established. The importance of compassion, the necessity of standing up for justice, the value of preserving what was precious while remaining open to beneficial change. These lessons could serve them, whether they became benders or politicians, parents or adventurers, leaders or followers, in the great work of building better communities and more just societies. The balance between preparing Tenzin for his unique role as the possible inheritor of air nomad traditions and allowing him to develop his own identity and interests according to his individual temperament required constant adjustment and careful attention to signs that expectations were becoming burdens that inhibited rather than supported his healthy growth toward whatever form of adulthood would serve both his personal fulfillment and his cultural responsibilities. The pressure that he faced was real and significant, but it needed to be managed in ways that strengthened rather than overwhelmed his developing sense of self and purpose. The moments of pure family happiness that occurred during these years, shared meals where everyone laughed together, quiet evenings when stories and games created bonds that transcended individual differences, celebrations of birthdays and achievements that belonged to all of them rather than any single person. These experiences provided the foundation for everything else that their relationships would become in future years when the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood would test the strength of connections that were being built through daily acts of love and mutual support. As the children approached the ages when their distinct personalities and individual paths would become more apparent, Aang found himself learning to balance his desire to share his knowledge and experience with respect for their autonomy and their right to choose their own directions through life. The father, who had once been the last of his kind, was discovering that successful preservation required evolution rather than simple repetition, that the future of air nomad culture would depend not on exact replication of the past, but on but on creative adaptation that preserved essential principles while serving the needs and interests of people who would face challenges that their ancestors could never have imagined or prepared them to handle. Effectively, the expansion of the Air Acolyte movement beyond its humble origins as an enthusiastic but unfocused fan club required careful transformation of genuine admiration into structured learning that could preserve and transmit Air Nomad traditions without reducing them to shallow imitation or misguided worship of personality rather than principle. The young people who had initially been drawn to Aang's heroic reputation gradually discovered that authentic spiritual development demanded far more than costume and catchphrases, requiring dedication to practices and philosophies that challenged comfortable assumptions about the relationship between individual desires and collective responsibility. The first formal classes that Aang established on Air Temple Island brought together seekers from all 4 nations, whose backgrounds and motivations were as diverse as their appearances and elemental abilities, their common interest in Air Nomad culture, providing starting point for explorations that would eventually reveal how much they needed to learn about themselves, as well as the traditions they hoped to embrace. The merchant's daughter from Ba Sing Se, who had grown disillusioned with her family's obsession with profit, discovered that meditation could provide perspectives on wealth and poverty that transformed her understanding of success and failure, while the former Fire Nation soldier, who had come seeking redemption for wartime actions, found that Air Nomad principles offered paths toward forgiveness that began with honest acknowledgement of harm caused rather than easy absolution that ignored consequences. The daily schedule that governed life for residential students combined traditional Air Nomad practices with adaptations necessary for people whose physical conditioning and mental preparation had not begun in early childhood under the guidance of masters who had lived these principles for decades before attempting to teach them to others. The meditation sessions that opened each day started with basic breathing exercises that seemed simple but proved challenging for minds accustomed to constant activity and stimulation, the silence revealing how thoroughly most people had learned to avoid confronting their own thoughts and emotions without external distraction or entertainment. The vegetarian meals that were served in community dining halls required adjustment not just in dietary habits but in fundamental attitudes toward the relationship between human needs and the lives of other creatures. The Air Nomad commitment to avoiding unnecessary harm, extending beyond simple food choices to encompass clothing, transportation, and recreational activities that conventional thinking rarely examined for their ethical implications. The discussions that accompanied shared meals often became informal philosophy lessons, as students struggled to understand how principles that seemed clear in abstract formulation became complex when applied to specific situations that admitted no perfect solutions. The physical training that prepared non-airbending students for the spiritual exercises that had originally been designed to complement elemental mastery required creative adaptation of movements and techniques that had assumed capabilities these practitioners could never develop regardless of their dedication or effort. The yoga-like forms that emerged from this process preserved the essential purposes of traditional exercises, while making them accessible to people whose bodies had different strengths and limitations, creating new pathways toward the same spiritual destinations that Air Nomad masters had reached through methods that were no longer completely replicable. The library that was assembled for student use contained not only the surviving fragments of Air Nomad literature, but also texts from other spiritual traditions that offered complementary perspectives on meditation, ethics, and the development of wisdom that transcended cultural boundaries while respecting the distinctive insights that different approaches to enlightenment had discovered through centuries of dedicated practice. The comparative studies that became possible through this collection helped students understand that air nomad principles were not arbitrary rules, but expressions of universal truths that could be recognized and applied regardless of one's cultural background or personal history. Tenzin's participation in the Air Acolyte program created complex dynamics that benefited both the other students and his own development, while also generating pressures and expectations that were sometimes difficult for a young airbender to manage appropriately. His natural abilities made certain exercises effortless, while his inherited knowledge provided him with theoretical understanding that practical experience had not yet deepened into wisdom, creating situations where he could demonstrate techniques without fully comprehending their spiritual significance or emotional implications for people who had chosen to embrace air nomad culture despite lacking the elemental connections that made such adoption feel natural rather than forced. The teaching methods that Aang developed for transmitting air nomad philosophy to culturally diverse students required him to identify the essential principles that lay beneath surface practices, distinguishing between elements that were fundamental to the spiritual tradition and those that had developed as responses to specific historical circumstances or geographical conditions that no longer applied in the contemporary world. The meditation techniques that had originally been practiced in mountain temples needed modification for urban environments, while dietary restrictions that had made sense in agricultural communities required interpretation for people whose food sources and economic circumstances were entirely different from those of pre-war air nomads. The success stories that emerged from the Air Acolyte program demonstrated that spiritual transformation was possible across cultural boundaries when instruction was adapted to meet students where they were, rather than demanding that they somehow become something they had never been and could never authentically claim to be. The Earth Kingdom farmer, who had lost his family during the war, discovered that air nomad forgiveness practices could heal wounds that time alone could never close, while the Fire Nation aristocrat, who had been raised on imperial propaganda, found that meditation could dissolve the superiority complex that had prevented her from forming genuine relationships with people from other nations or social classes. The challenges that arose when students attempted to apply air nomad principles to family relationships and professional obligations that had been established before their spiritual awakening created ongoing tension between idealistic aspirations and practical necessities that could not be simply ignored or abandoned without causing harm to people who depended on their fulfillment of previous commitments. The merchant who wanted to adopt air nomad truthfulness found that complete honesty about business practices would destroy commercial relationships that supported not only his own family, but also the employees who relied on his enterprise for their livelihoods, creating moral dilemmas that required wisdom beyond simple rule following. The progression from basic instruction to advanced practice required years of patient development that tested students' commitment when the initial enthusiasm of discovery gave way to the sustained effort that genuine transformation demanded over time periods that measured progress in barely perceptible increments rather than dramatic breakthroughs that provided immediate satisfaction and validation. The dropout rate was significant among students who had expected spiritual development to be easier or faster than it actually proved to be. But those who persevered discovered that the gradual changes were more profound and durable than sudden conversions that often proved superficial when tested by real-world pressures and temptations. The advanced students who completed several years of training became eligible for teaching responsibilities that allowed them to share their knowledge with newcomers, while deepening their own understanding through the process of higher explanation and demonstration that revealed gaps in comprehension that individual practice had not exposed. The teaching opportunities also provided them with practical experience in adapting air nomad principles to different personalities and circumstances, developing the flexibility and creativity that effective spiritual guidance required when working with people whose needs and capabilities varied significantly from their own backgrounds and learning styles. The seasonal retreats that brought air acolytes from Republic City and the restored air temples together for intensive study periods created community experiences that strengthened bonds between students while providing opportunities for sharing insights and challenges that individual practice sometimes made difficult to process without support from others who were pursuing similar paths. The group meditations and collaborative projects that characterized these gatherings demonstrated how individual spiritual development could contribute to collective wisdom without requiring the loss of personal identity or authentic individual expression that some spiritual traditions seem to demand. The ordination ceremonies that marked students' transition from novice to full air acolyte status were designed to honor their achievement while emphasizing the ongoing nature of spiritual development that would continue throughout their lifetimes, rather than ending with any particular level of attainment or recognition. The vows that were taken during these ceremonies committed practitioners to continued learning and service while preserving their freedom to interpret air nomad principles according to their individual circumstances and evolving understanding of how ancient wisdom could serve contemporary needs and challenges. The outreach programs that brought air nomad meditation and philosophy to communities throughout the United Republic and beyond created opportunities for people who could not afford residential training or extended study periods to benefit from teachings that had previously been available only to those with sufficient leisure and resources for intensive spiritual development. The simplified instruction that was offered through these programs necessarily omitted some of the subtleties and complexities that full training provided, but it served valuable purposes in introducing broader populations to perspectives and practices that could improve their daily lives while creating appreciation for more comprehensive approaches to wisdom and ethical development. The preservation work that air acolytes undertook in the restored temples involved not only maintaining buildings and artifacts, but also continuing the scholarly research that was gradually reconstructing knowledge that had been thought lost forever when the genocide eliminated the people who had carried such information in their memories and practical experience. The archaeological investigations that uncovered fragments of texts and objects from pre-war air nomad life provided clues that helped fill gaps in understanding, while raising new questions about aspects of the culture that written records had never adequately documented. The agricultural experiments that some air acolytes conducted were attempts to recreate the farming and food preparation techniques that had sustained air nomad communities in their mountain environments. But the lack of original seed varieties and the changed climate conditions that had resulted from a century of war and industrial development made exact replication impossible. The substitutions and adaptations that were necessary preserved some traditional practices while creating new approaches that served similar purposes, demonstrating how living traditions needed to evolve in response to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character and values. The artistic projects that emerged from air acolyte communities represented creative interpretations of traditional air nomad aesthetics applied to contemporary materials and themes, producing music, visual art, and literature that honored ancient principles while addressing modern concerns and experiences that the original culture had never encountered. The fusion of traditional and contemporary elements in these works created new forms of cultural expression that belonged fully to neither past nor present, while serving the important function of keeping spiritual and philosophical insights alive and relevant for each new generation of practitioners. the family tensions that sometimes developed when individuals embraced air nomad lifestyle, changes that conflicted with established household patterns or community expectations, required careful navigation that balanced personal, spiritual development with responsibilities. To people who had not chosen such transformation, but whose lives were affected by the choices that practitioners made. The Air acolyte, who adopted vegetarianism, found that family meals became occasions for argument rather than bonding, while the merchant, who tried to implement air nomad business ethics, discovered that competitors who maintained conventional practices could offer lower prices and faster service than honesty and environmental consciousness allowed. The leadership structure that developed within the Air acolyte movement reflected air nomad principles of consensus and shared responsibility rather than hierarchical authority. But creating effective governance without traditional power structures required experimentation and adaptation that sometimes produced confusion or inefficiency when decisions needed to be made quickly or when conflicting viewpoints could not be easily reconciled through discussion and compromise. The councils that were established to guide community activities and resolve disputes drew on techniques that had worked in small, culturally homogeneous groups, but needed modification for larger, more diverse populations with different backgrounds and expectations about how authority should operate. The economic sustainability of Air acolyte communities required balancing spiritual ideals about simple living and minimal material possessions with practical necessities for housing, food, education, and medical care that could not be wished away through meditation or philosophical reflection. The crafts and services that communities developed to generate income needed to align with air nomad ethical principles, while providing sufficient revenue to support the people who had committed their lives to spiritual development and cultural preservation rather than conventional career advancement or wealth accumulation. As the Air acolyte movement matured and its first generation of students reached positions of responsibility and leadership, Aang began to see evidence that his people's culture could indeed survive and flourish in forms that honored its essential spirit while adapting to circumstances that no previous generation had faced or could have prepared for through traditional education and preparation. The success of these dedicated practitioners in transmitting wisdom across cultural boundaries provided hope that the genocide's destruction of air nomad communities had not eliminated the possibility of their spiritual and philosophical contributions continuing to benefit the world through people who had chosen to embrace these teachings despite having no biological or cultural connection to their original context. The prosperity that Republic City achieved during its first decade of existence created opportunities and challenges that the idealistic founders had not fully anticipated. The rapid growth, bringing wealth and cultural vitality, while also generating new forms of inequality and social tension that required careful management to prevent them from undermining the multicultural cooperation that made the city's experiment in international unity possible. The population that swelled beyond all early projections included not only hopeful immigrants seeking better lives, but also individuals whose motives were less admirable, criminals and opportunists who saw in the city's diverse, bustling environment perfect conditions for enterprises that conventional law enforcement was not yet equipped to detect or counter effectively. The organized crime that began to emerge from Republic City's shadows was unlike the simple banditry or smuggling operations that had plagued other urban centers throughout history, demonstrating sophistication and coordination that suggested leadership with both strategic intelligence and access to resources that legitimate businesses might envy. The initial reports that reached Aang through Chief Toph's police department described incidents that seemed impossible, according to established understanding of how bending abilities worked. Victims. Speaking of experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of elemental manipulation and the consent required for one person's bending to affect another's body without their permission or cooperation, the crime lord, who would become known as Yakone, had built his organization through methods that left no conventional evidence, while creating psychological trauma in victims that was far more devastating than simple theft or assault. His blood-bending abilities, allowing him to control people's bodies and actions, without leaving physical traces that traditional investigation techniques could identify or use as proof in legal proceedings designed for more ordinary forms of criminal activity. The technique that he wielded violated every principle that waterbending masters had established about their art's proper applications and limitations, demonstrating mastery that seemed to require complete abandonment of the ethical constraints that had previously governed how elemental abilities could be used against unwilling targets. The victims whose testimonies began reaching police attention described violations of bodily autonomy that were more intimate and terrifying than physical violence. Their accounts of being forced to move against their will while remaining fully conscious and aware, creating trauma that conventional healing methods were inadequate to address effectively. The wealthy merchants who found themselves compelled to open their safes and hand over their most valuable possessions while unable to resist or call for help suffered damage to their sense of personal agency that persisted long after their material losses had been replaced or forgotten. Chief Toff's investigation of these unprecedented crimes was hampered by the absence of physical evidence and the reluctance of victims to provide detailed accounts of experiences that challenged their understanding of their own autonomy, while making them feel vulnerable in ways that no amount of security or protection could adequately address. The earth-bending sensors that could detect lies in normal testimony proved useless when people were telling absolute truth about events that seemed impossible, while the metal-bending techniques that had revolutionized law enforcement provided no advantages against crimes that left no metal traces or physical clues beyond their psychological impact. The pattern that emerged from careful analysis of incident reports revealed systematic targeting and planning that went far beyond opportunistic criminal activity, suggesting campaign designed not just to generate illegal profit, but to demonstrate power that transcended normal understanding of what any individual could accomplish through bending abilities that had been thought to operate within clearly defined limits. The crimes seemed calculated to inspire fear and helplessness as much as to acquire wealth, creating an atmosphere of vulnerability that made everyone feel potentially defenseless, regardless of their individual capabilities, social position, or the security measures they employed for protection. Aang's personal investigation began with interviews of victims who were willing to discuss their experiences with someone whose avatar status provided both authority to investigate and spiritual insight that might enable understanding of techniques that conventional analysis could not explain satisfactorily. The conversations that followed were difficult for everyone involved, requiring people to relive trauma while describing violations that felt more intimate than physical assault, despite leaving no lasting physical damage that healers could identify or treat through normal methods and procedures. The blood-bending that Yakone employed was clearly an extension of traditional water-bending principles, but its application during daylight hours and without full moon enhancement suggested mastery that exceeded anything recorded in bending texts or preserved in cultural memory from the time before war's disruption had eliminated many teaching lineages and traditional knowledge systems. The ability to manipulate another person's circulatory system and nervous functions required not just exceptional technical skill, but philosophical approach that treated other human beings as objects to be controlled rather than fellow conscious entities deserving of respect and consideration for their inherent dignity. The moral implications of bloodbending's existence forced Aang to confront questions about the relationship between elemental abilities and ethical behavior that his air nomad upbringing had not prepared him to address adequately. The technique's very possibility challenging assumptions about the natural limits that were supposed to prevent bending from becoming tool of tyranny rather than expression of harmony with elemental forces. The discovery that waterbending could be perverted into such violation of consent and autonomy created crisis of understanding about whether his people's gentle philosophy about elemental manipulation had been naive, or whether Yakone represented corruption so profound that it transcended normal categories of moral evaluation. The collaboration between Avatar and police that eventually tracked Yakone to his base of operations required coordination between very different approaches to law enforcement. Aang's spiritual insights complementing Toph's practical experience, while her metal-bending capabilities provided tactical advantages that conventional investigation techniques could not match against opponents who possessed abilities that rendered normal security measures useless. The combination of Avatar power and innovative police methodology created effectiveness that neither could have achieved independently, while demonstrating how traditional wisdom and contemporary innovation could strengthen each other when properly coordinated toward common objectives. The restaurant that served as front for Yakone's criminal empire was both legitimate business and carefully designed fortress, its architecture incorporating defensive features that were simultaneously conventional and elemental while providing escape routes that took advantage of waterbending mobility and the urban environment's complex infrastructure of sewers, waterways, and underground passages that normal pursuit could not navigate effectively. The building's design reflected thorough understanding of both Republic City's layout and the capabilities that law enforcement was likely to deploy against organized criminal activities. The confrontation that erupted when police forces surrounded Quan's cuisine tested every aspect of Yakone's blood-bending mastery against Avatar power that he had clearly studied and prepared to counter through techniques that exploited specific limitations and vulnerabilities that even cosmic abilities could not eliminate completely. His attacks were precisely targeted to disrupt Aang's bending coordination, while avoiding the kind of dramatic violence that might trigger Avatar state responses that his careful planning could not anticipate or control through Aang's conventional strategic preparation and tactical positioning. The initial success of Yakone's bloodbending in overpowering Aang, despite the Avatar's superior elemental training and spiritual authority, demonstrated how thoroughly the crime lord had analyzed his opponent's capabilities and developed countermeasures that exploited weaknesses in Avatar power that few people had ever discovered or been willing to test through direct confrontation. The technique's effectiveness against someone of Aang's abilities was both terrifying and educational, revealing vulnerabilities that future enemies might also identify and exploit if proper precautions were not developed and maintained through ongoing security assessment and improvement. The experience of being controlled so completely was traumatic in ways that went far beyond immediate physical danger to encompass existential questions about free will and personal autonomy that would influence Aang's thinking about power and its proper applications for the remainder of his life. The helplessness of feeling his own body respond to another person's commands, while his consciousness remained trapped inside flesh that no longer obeyed his intentions, created understanding of violation that no amount of theoretical knowledge or empathetic imagination could have provided through less direct means of education. Toph's resistance to Yakone's bloodbending proved more effective than Aang's initial efforts, her earthbending connection to solid ground, providing stability that liquid-based manipulation could not completely overcome, while her practical experience with unconventional combat situations enabled her to adapt quickly to threats that theoretical training had not prepared her to face effectively. Her metal-bending students demonstrated coordination and tactical flexibility that complemented their unique abilities, while showing how proper preparation and teamwork could create advantages that individual skill alone could never achieve against opponents with superior raw power. The trial that followed Yakone's capture became test of Republic City's legal institutions and their capacity to address crimes that challenged established categories of evidence and testimony, while dealing with defendant whose abilities posed ongoing threats to courtroom security and public safety that conventional procedures had never been designed to handle. The legal precedents that were established during these proceedings would influence how future cases involving unusual bending abilities would be prosecuted, creating frameworks that attempted to balance individual rights with community protection needs through careful consideration of unprecedented circumstances. Yakone's confident assertion that he would escape conviction reflected understanding of legal systems and their limitations that suggested corruption or intimidation extending throughout Republic City's government and judicial establishments. His casual attitude towards serious charges indicating either delusional thinking or access to resources and influence that prosecution had not anticipated or prepared to counter through normal investigative and legal procedures. The crime lord's behavior during trial suggested certainty about outcomes that proved justified when his escape plan was finally revealed through catastrophic demonstration of his true capabilities. The courtroom attack that Yakone launched when his conviction was announced exceeded even pessimistic estimates of what his blood-bending abilities might encompass under optimal conditions. His simultaneous manipulation of everyone present, showing mastery that approached supernatural levels of precision and control over multiple targets, whose resistance he had to overcome individually, while maintaining concentration sufficient to prevent any single person from breaking free and alerting external authorities. The technique's effectiveness against trained law enforcement officers and legal professionals demonstrated preparation that had involved systematic study and practice on unwilling subjects over extended periods. The avatar state that eventually enabled Aang to break free from Yakone's control was triggered not by conscious decision but by desperate spiritual response to threats that endangered not just his individual existence but the continuity of the avatar cycle itself. Cosmic forces recognizing danger that transcended normal categories of personal peril to encompass damage that could affect the eternal pattern of reincarnation and spiritual guidance that the world depended upon for maintaining balance between material and spiritual realms. The power that flowed through his consciousness provided protection against blood-bending manipulation while enabling pursuit of criminal whose escape would have made him untouchable through conventional law enforcement methods. The chase through Republic City's streets that followed tested both participants' abilities under conditions of extreme stress and physical exhaustion. Yakone's bloodbending providing mobility advantages that were balanced by Aang's air scooter technology and superior knowledge of urban geography that came from years of residence and patrol duties throughout the metropolitan area. The pursuit demonstrated how quickly legal proceedings could escalate into life or death confrontations when dealing with criminals whose abilities transcended normal categories of threat assessment and tactical planning that police departments were equipped to handle. The energy bending that Aang employed to remove Yakone's abilities permanently was applied under circumstances that met all criteria that spiritual authorities had established for safe use of the technique. the crime lord's actions having demonstrated moral corruption so complete that intervention was justified to prevent future harm to innocent people who had no defense against abilities that conventional law enforcement could not counter effectively. The process was more difficult than it had been with Fire Lord Ozai, Yakoni's resistance reflecting both his powerful will and his intimate understanding of his own capabilities and their spiritual sources. The physical and psychological toll that the confrontation took on Aang was more severe than he initially realized. The stress of being controlled through bloodbending, having created damage to his nervous system and spiritual connections that would influence his health and abilities for the remaining years of his life. The trauma of violation and helplessness required processing that conventional healing methods could not provide, while the knowledge that such abilities existed and could be developed by others created ongoing anxiety about vulnerabilities that avatar power could not eliminate completely through preparation or training. The family tensions that emerged during this crisis reflected broader challenges of maintaining normal domestic life while fulfilling avatar responsibilities that could require sudden absence during emergencies that admitted no delay for personal considerations or family needs. Katara's worry about her husband's safety was complicated by her understanding that his duties sometimes required risks that could not be avoided or minimized without abandoning people who depended on avatar intervention for protection against threats that no one else could address. Effectively, the impact on their children of seeing their father vulnerable and traumatized challenged their understanding of avatar power and the security that they had assumed his abilities provided for their family's safety and happiness. Tenzin's questions about whether airbending could protect against bloodbending revealed concerns that went beyond technical curiosity to encompass fears about his own future vulnerability and the limitations of abilities that he was working so hard to master for both personal development and cultural preservation purposes. As Republic City gradually recovered from the crisis and implemented new security measures designed to prevent similar threats, Aang found himself contemplating the darker possibilities that bending abilities could encompass when divorced from ethical constraints and spiritual wisdom that traditional teaching had always emphasized as inseparable from technical mastery. The knowledge that elements could be perverted into tools of violation and control would influence his approach to instruction and his understanding of the responsibilities that came with power, whether cosmic or merely elemental in scope and application. The years that followed the Yakoni crisis brought a different kind of responsibility to Aang's life, one that required wisdom rather than power, patience rather than decisive action, and the subtle art of guidance that operated through influence and example, rather than the dramatic interventions that had characterized his younger years as Avatar. The world had grown more complex during the decades since the war's end, its problems requiring solutions that could not be achieved through individual heroism, but demanded sustained cooperation between institutions and leaders whose different perspectives and priorities needed to be harmonized in service of outcomes that served everyone's long-term interests, rather than anyone's immediate advantages. The transformation from active hero to wise counselor was neither sudden nor complete, the change occurring gradually as Aang discovered that many of the challenges facing the post-war world required different approaches than those that had served during the period when survival itself had been uncertain and every decision carried life or death consequences for millions of people. The diplomatic skills that peacetime demanded were more subtle and complex than the straightforward moral choices that had defined the conflict between Fire Nation tyranny and the freedom that the other nations had fought to preserve and restore. The international disputes that required Avatar mediation during this period were rarely matters of simple right and wrong, but involved competing claims and conflicting interests that had developed legitimate foundations through decades or centuries of historical experience that could not be dismissed as mere selfishness or political manipulation. The border disagreements between Earth Kingdom provinces and Fire Nation territories reflected genuine uncertainties about traditional boundaries that war had disrupted, while creating new communities whose loyalties and identities transcended the neat categories that maps attempted to impose on human relationships that had evolved according to practical necessity rather than political theory. The trade conflicts that arose as the four nations rebuilt their economic relationships after a century of war-driven isolation required understanding of commercial practices and financial systems that Aang's air nomad education had not prepared him to comprehend fully, forcing him to rely on advisors whose expertise in such matters was essential for making informed judgments about disputes that seemed technical but carried profound implications for the prosperity and stability of entire regions. The complexity of international commerce in the post-war world meant that even seemingly simple disagreements about tariffs or shipping rights could affect the livelihoods of thousands of people whose interests were not always aligned with those of their political leaders. The role that Aang played in these negotiations was rarely that of final arbiter, but rather that of trusted facilitator, whose spiritual authority and demonstrated commitment to fairness enabled him to create conditions where opposing parties could find common ground despite their different starting positions and competing objectives. The meditation techniques that he taught to diplomatic participants helped them approach discussions with greater emotional clarity and reduced defensiveness, while his ability to identify underlying needs and interests that lay beneath surface positions allowed for creative solutions that conventional bargaining approaches could not discover or implement effectively. The White Lotus organization that had supported Aang during the final stages of the war evolved during this period into something resembling an international advisory council, its members providing expertise and perspective that complemented the Avatar's spiritual insights while helping to coordinate policies and initiatives that required sustained attention over time periods that exceeded what any individual leader could maintain without institutional support. The Grand Masters, who had once been primarily focused on preserving ancient knowledge and protecting the Avatar, began to take more active roles in addressing contemporary challenges that required their accumulated wisdom and international connections. The younger generation of leaders, who rose to positions of authority throughout the four nations during these years, brought different perspectives and priorities than their predecessors. Having grown up during the war's final phases, or in the immediate aftermath of peace, when reconstruction and innovation seemed more important than preserving traditional ways of doing things that had proved inadequate for preventing or ending the century-long conflict. Their willingness to experiment with new approaches to governance and international relations created opportunities for progress, while also generating tensions with older officials who feared that too much change too quickly could destabilize the foundations that had made recovery possible. Aang's mentorship of these emerging leaders required him to balance encouragement of their innovative thinking with gentle guidance that helped them understand the wisdom embedded in traditions that might seem outdated but contained insights that remained relevant for addressing nature's consistent patterns, despite changing technological and political circumstances. The Fire Lord Izumi, who succeeded her father Zuko, brought energy and fresh ideas to her nation's continuing efforts at making amends for the war's devastation. But she also needed guidance about the patience that genuine reconciliation required when dealing with peoples whose suffering could not be healed through good intentions alone. The Earth Kingdom's gradual transition toward more centralized governance under King Kuei's successors required careful management to avoid the kind of heavy-handed control that had enabled the Dai Li conspiracy while still providing sufficient coordination to address challenges that individual provinces could not handle effectively on their own. The regional autonomy that had developed during the war years served important purposes in allowing local communities to address their specific needs and preferences, but it also created obstacles to implementing policies that required unified action across the kingdom's vast and diverse territories. The development of international law during this period established precedents and procedures that would govern relations between nations for generations to come. The agreements that were negotiated and the institutions that were created reflecting hard-won understanding of how to balance sovereignty with cooperation, while providing mechanisms for resolving disputes before they escalated into conflicts that could threaten the peace that had been achieved through such enormous sacrifice and effort. Aang's role in these deliberations was often that of conscience and reminder, helping negotiators remember the human costs that political failures could create, while encouraging them to think beyond immediate tactical advantages toward outcomes that would serve their children's interests as well as their own. The Republic City Council that governed the United Republic's capital became a model for democratic institutions throughout the world, its successes and failures providing lessons about how diverse populations could participate meaningfully in decisions that affected their lives, while maintaining efficiency and accountability that enabled government to function effectively rather than becoming paralyzed by competing demands and conflicting priorities. The representatives who served on the council brought different cultural backgrounds and professional experiences that enriched deliberations, while sometimes making consensus more difficult to achieve when fundamental values seemed to conflict. The challenges that arose as Republic City's population continued to grow and diversify required constant adaptation of policies and procedures that had worked well for smaller, more homogeneous communities, but proved inadequate for addressing the complex needs and competing interests that characterized a truly international metropolis. The housing shortages that developed as immigration exceeded construction capacity, created opportunities for exploitation and discrimination that required active government intervention to prevent, while the cultural tensions that occasionally flared between different ethnic communities needed careful mediation to resolve before they could undermine the social cohesion that made the city's multicultural experiment possible. The education system that was established to serve Republic City's diverse student population required curricula and teaching methods that could prepare young people for citizenship in a society where they would need to work and live alongside peers from very different backgrounds, while maintaining appreciation for their own cultural heritages and the contributions that each tradition could make to the common good. The schools that emerged from these efforts became laboratories for developing pedagogical approaches that other communities throughout the world would eventually adopt and adapt for their own multicultural educational challenges. The economic policies that guided Republic City's development during this period attempted to balance the benefits of free trade and open markets with protections for workers and communities that might be disadvantaged by rapid change or unfair competition. The regulations that were implemented reflecting understanding that prosperity needed to be broadly shared if it was to contribute to social stability, rather than creating resentments and inequalities that could undermine democratic governance and peaceful coexistence between different groups. The spiritual guidance that Aang provided during this period often took the form of public teaching and private counseling that helped individuals and communities navigate the ethical challenges that arose when traditional values seemed to conflict with contemporary circumstances, or when rapid change created confusion about appropriate responses to situations that had no clear precedents in cultural memory or religious instruction. The meditation centers that were established throughout Republic City and other major urban areas provided spaces where people could find peace and clarity amid the pressures and distractions of modern life, while learning techniques for managing stress and conflict that drew from air nomad wisdom, but were adapted for contemporary needs and schedules. The environmental concerns that began to emerge as industrialization expanded throughout the post-war world required Aang's attention as both avatar and advocate for the natural harmony that air nomad philosophy had always emphasized as essential for human flourishing and spiritual development. The pollution that was beginning to affect air and water quality in heavily industrialized areas threatened not only public health, but also the spiritual connections between human communities and the natural world that sustained them, physically and emotionally, creating challenges that required balancing economic development with environmental protection through policies that served both human needs and ecological stability. The technological innovations that were transforming daily life throughout the four nations created opportunities for improving living standards and expanding human capabilities, while also raising questions about whether such rapid change was compatible with the spiritual values and community relationships that had traditionally provided meaning and purpose for individual lives. The mechanization that was increasing agricultural productivity and industrial output also displaced workers whose skills had become obsolete, requiring social policies that could help people adapt to changing economic conditions without abandoning them to poverty and desperation that could fuel political instability. The international organizations that were created during this period to address challenges that transcended national boundaries required Aang's support and guidance as they developed procedures and established precedents for cooperation that had no historical models to follow. The coordination of policies and resources across cultural and political divisions, demanding new forms of diplomacy and administration that could function effectively despite the linguistic and cultural barriers that complicated communication and mutual understanding between peoples who had been enemies within living memory. The legacy that Aang hoped to leave through his work as elder statesman and wise counselor was not measured in dramatic victories or decisive battles, but in the gradual strengthening of institutions and relationships that could maintain peace and promote justice through the patient daily work of millions of individuals who had learned to value cooperation over competition, understanding over prejudice, and long-term wisdom over short-term advantage. The seeds that were planted during these years of quiet leadership would eventually grow into the stable, prosperous, and peaceful world that his actions during the war had made possible, but could not have achieved without the sustained effort that followed military victory. As the responsibilities of active avatar intervention gradually shifted to others who had been trained and inspired by his example, Aang began to understand that his greatest contribution to the world's continued healing lay not in solving every problem that arose, but in creating conditions where others could solve problems themselves through the application of principles and practices that transcended any individual's lifespan or capabilities. The bridge between worlds that he had always been called to be was becoming a bridge between past and future, connecting the wisdom of previous generations with the needs and aspirations of those who would inherit the world that his generation's choices were creating through their daily decisions about how to live and work together. The transition from middle age to what others might consider the beginning of elderhood brought Aang a different relationship with time and legacy, the urgency that had once driven his every decision, gradually giving way to the longer perspective that comes when someone realizes that their most important contributions may lie not in what they accomplish directly, but in how well they prepare others to continue work that will extend far beyond any single lifetime. The responsibilities that had once felt overwhelming in their immediacy now seemed part of larger patterns that required patience and wisdom rather than the dramatic interventions that had characterized his younger years as Avatar and world saver. Tenzin's development into a capable adult airbender and thoughtful leader brought Aang profound satisfaction, while also creating new forms of concern about the pressures that his son would face as the primary inheritor of Air Nomad, traditions, and the expectations that would inevitably accompany such a unique position in the post-war world. The young man who had grown up under the weight of cultural preservation had evolved into someone who could balance respect for ancient wisdom with creative adaptation to contemporary circumstances. But the loneliness that came with being one of only 2 airbenders in existence remained a challenge that no amount of training or preparation could completely eliminate. The possibility of grandchildren that would carry airbending abilities into another generation had become a source of both hope and anxiety for Aang. His awareness that the future of his people's elemental traditions might depend on the romantic choices and family planning decisions of his youngest son, creating pressures that he tried to avoid placing on Tenzin directly, while finding it impossible to ignore the implications of such dependence on individual circumstances beyond anyone's complete control. The air nomad culture that he had worked so hard to preserve and transmit would face its ultimate test in whether it could survive and flourish when practiced by people who had never experienced it as a living community tradition. The relationships that Tenzin formed with potential romantic partners were observed by his father with interest that he tried to keep appropriately subtle. Aang's natural curiosity about who might become part of their family, complicated by awareness that too much attention or advice could create exactly the kind of pressure that might drive his son away from making choices that served both personal happiness and cultural continuity. The delicate balance between offering guidance and respecting autonomy required constant adjustment as circumstances changed and relationships developed according to their own internal dynamics. Bumi and Kia's paths through adulthood provided different forms of satisfaction and concern as they established careers and relationships that reflected their individual personalities and interests, while maintaining the family bonds that had been strengthened through shared experiences during their childhood and adolescence. Bumi's service in the United Forces demonstrated the same courage and dedication that had characterized his father's approach to Avatar responsibilities, his lack of bending abilities proving no obstacle to making meaningful contributions to the peace and security that enabled others to pursue their dreams and ambitions without fear of war or chaos. Kia's work as a healer and her involvement in advancing women's rights throughout the world carried forward the compassion and justice-seeking that she had inherited from both parents, while applying these values to challenges that previous generations had not been positioned to address effectively. Her waterbending abilities served not as sources of power or prestige, but as tools for helping others overcome illness and injury. Her medical practice reflecting the air nomad principle that individual talents should be used in service of collective well-being, rather than personal advancement or recognition. The conversations that Aang had with his adult children during this period revealed how successfully they had internalized the values that he and Katara had tried to instill during their upbringing, while developing their own perspectives on how such principles should be applied to situations and challenges that their parents' generation had not faced or could not have anticipated. The independence of thought and moral courage that all 3 children demonstrated provided evidence that good parenting involved preparing young people to make their own decisions rather than simply following instructions or repeating Patterns that had worked in different circumstances. The deaths of old friends and companions during these years brought grief that was sharpened by recognition that each loss represented the passing of unique perspectives and experiences that could never be exactly replicated. The gradual thinning of the generation that had lived through the war and participated in the great work of building peace, creating a different kind of loneliness than Aang had experienced as the last airbender. The memorial services and funeral rites that marked these passages provided opportunities for reflection on shared achievements and the continuing influence that good people could have long after their physical presence was no longer available for consultation or companionship. Sokka's death was particularly difficult for Aang to process. The loss of someone who had been both tactical genius and source of humor during the most dangerous period of their shared youth, creating an emptiness that no amount of philosophical understanding about the natural cycles of life and death could completely fill. The memorial that was held in Republic City brought together people from all 4 nations who had been touched by Sokka's intelligence, creativity, and generous spirit, their stories revealing the breadth of influence that one person could have through dedication to serving others and maintaining optimism even during the most challenging circumstances. The spiritual practices that had always been central to Aang's life took on deeper meaning during this period as he found himself drawn more frequently to meditation and communion with previous avatar incarnations whose guidance seemed increasingly relevant for questions about aging, mortality, and the proper preparation for whatever transitions lay ahead. The conversations that took place during these spiritual journeys provided perspectives on the avatar cycle's continuity that helped him understand his individual role within patterns that extended far beyond personal concerns or even generational changes. Avatar Roku's presence seemed particularly strong during these meditative sessions, the previous incarnation's experiences with aging and death providing insights that were both practical and spiritual about how to approach the final phases of life with dignity and wisdom rather than fear or regret. The understanding that emerged from these communications emphasized that each avatar's contribution to the eternal cycle was measured not by the length of their individual service, but by how well they prepared the way for their successors and the ongoing work of maintaining balance between spiritual and material worlds. The projects that Aang undertook to preserve air nomad knowledge and culture during this period reflected his growing awareness that time was limited and that certain forms of wisdom could only be transmitted through intensive, personal instruction that required both teacher and student to be fully present and committed to the process. The detailed records that he created of meditation techniques, philosophical principles, and spiritual practices went beyond simple documentation to include the kind of contextual explanation and interpretive guidance that would be essential for future practitioners who might not have access to living masters with direct experience of pre-war air nomad traditions. The restoration work that continued at the 4 air temples during these years emphasized creating sustainable communities and educational institutions that could function independently rather than requiring constant supervision or intervention from someone with Aang's unique knowledge and authority. The air acolytes who had matured into teachers and administrators demonstrated increasing capability to manage day-to-day operations while preserving the essential spiritual and cultural elements that made these places meaningful, rather than merely functional as retreat centers or historical monuments. The writing that Aang began during this period attempted to capture not only the technical aspects of air nomad philosophy and practice, but also the lived experience of growing up within a culture that no longer existed except in memory and carefully reconstructed fragments. The autobiography that slowly took shape during quiet evenings was intended less as historical record than as spiritual guidance for future generations who would need to understand how traditional wisdom could be adapted to circumstances that the original practitioners could never have imagined or prepared for through established teachings. The correspondence that Aang maintained with leaders throughout the world became a form of ongoing consultation and guidance that extended his influence far beyond what direct travel and personal meetings could accomplish. His letters providing perspectives on challenges and opportunities that local authorities might not be able to see clearly from within their particular circumstances and immediate pressures. The advice that he offered was rarely prescriptive, but rather consisted of questions and observations that could help others think more clearly about their own situations and the options available for addressing whatever difficulties they faced. The international conferences that brought together representatives from all 4 nations during this period benefited from Aang's presence not as active participant, but as wise elder whose experience and spiritual authority provided context and continuity for discussions about policies and initiatives that would affect future generations. His role at these gatherings was often that of reminder and conscience, helping negotiators remember the human costs that political failures could create, while encouraging them to consider long-term consequences rather than focusing exclusively on immediate advantages or short-term solutions. The grandchildren who began to arrive during Aang's later 50s brought joy that was complicated by awareness that he might not live long enough to see them reach maturity or to provide them with the kind of extended guidance and support that he had been able to offer his own children during their development. The babies who carried both airbending potential and the hopes of an entire culture represented possibilities for the future that were both thrilling and sobering, their existence providing evidence that life could indeed continue across generations, while their dependence reminded everyone involved how fragile such continuity could be. The teaching sessions that Aang conducted with young airbending students who were not his own descendants provided opportunities to test whether air nomad traditions could be transmitted effectively to children from different cultural backgrounds whose families had chosen to embrace these practices, without the biological or historical connections that might have made such adoption feel natural rather than deliberate. The successes and challenges that emerged from these experiments offered insights into how living traditions could adapt and evolve while maintaining their essential character and spiritual effectiveness. The quiet satisfaction that came from seeing Republic City flourish as a model of international cooperation and cultural synthesis was balanced by awareness that such achievements required ongoing attention and care to maintain the social and political harmony that had been built through decades of patient work, remaining vulnerable to the kinds of tensions and conflicts that could emerge when economic pressures or cultural misunderstandings created divisions between groups whose interests had once seemed perfectly aligned. The environmental changes that were becoming apparent throughout the world during this period required attention that went beyond local pollution control or conservation efforts to encompass larger questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world and the spiritual connections that air nomad philosophy had always emphasized as essential for maintaining balance between material progress and ecological stability. The industrial development that had improved living standards and expanded human capabilities was also creating challenges that would require wisdom and cooperation on scales that had never been necessary during previous historical periods. As the years accumulated and his role gradually shifted from active leadership to advisory council, Aang found himself appreciating moments of simple peace and quiet contentment that had once seemed like luxuries but now felt like the most precious aspects of a life that had been blessed with opportunities to serve purposes larger than individual happiness, while still experiencing the personal joys and satisfactions that made such service meaningful rather than merely dutiful. The first signs that something fundamental was changing in Aang's physical condition appeared so gradually that he initially dismissed them as the natural consequences of an active life that had placed unusual demands on his body. The occasional stiffness in his joints and the fatigue that lingered longer after exertion, seeming like reasonable responses to decades of avatar responsibilities that had required him to push his capabilities beyond what most people could sustain without eventually paying some price for such intensity and dedication. The morning meditations that had always provided clarity and energy began to feel different during his 60th year. The spiritual connections that had once flowed as naturally as breathing, now requiring more effort and concentration to establish. The avatar state that had been accessible through simple intention, becoming elusive in ways that created concern, not just about his immediate capabilities, but about whether something deeper was changing in his relationship with the cosmic forces that had defined his identity since childhood, awakening to his true nature as the bridge between worlds. The healers whom Aang consulted during this period approached his symptoms with the mixture of reverence and uncertainty that came from treating someone whose unique physiology and spiritual characteristics made conventional medical knowledge inadequate for understanding what might be happening to his aging body. The waterbending masters who examined him found no obvious injuries or diseases that could explain his declining energy and coordination, while the traditional healers from all four nations offered theories and treatments that seemed to have little effect on symptoms that appeared to transcend normal categories of illness or injury. Katara's growing concern about her husband's condition was complicated by her own expertise as a healer, her ability to sense the changes in his life force and energy patterns, providing her with awareness that something significant was wrong, while her knowledge of healing techniques left her feeling helpless to address problems that seemed to originate from sources beyond anything that conventional treatment could influence or correct. The woman who had saved his life multiple times through her waterbending abilities now faced the possibility that her skills might be inadequate for protecting him from whatever was causing his gradual decline. The attempts to maintain his normal schedule of avatar duties became increasingly difficult, as Aang found that activities which had once required minimal effort now left him exhausted and sometimes disoriented. The international crises that still required his mediation, demanding levels of energy and concentration that were becoming harder to sustain for the extended periods that complex negotiations and diplomatic interventions typically required. The recognition that he might need to begin delegating responsibilities that had been his alone for decades created anxiety about whether the world was prepared for such transitions and whether the institutions that had been built around his presence could function effectively without his direct involvement. The conversations with Tenzin during this period took on new urgency as Aang began to realize that his son might need to assume greater responsibility for preserving and transmitting air nomad culture sooner than either of them had anticipated, the gradual transfer of knowledge and authority becoming more pressing when viewed against the possibility that time for such preparation might be more limited than they had assumed. The teaching sessions that had once been relaxed explorations of philosophy and technique became more systematic and comprehensive as Aang worked to ensure that essential wisdom would not be lost if his decline continued or accelerated beyond what recovery might be possible. The dreams that began to disturb Aang's sleep during this period were filled with images and sensations from his century in the iceberg, memories that had been suppressed or forgotten during the decades since his awakening, now returning with clarity that was both vivid and disturbing. The visions of his time in suspended animation revealed experiences that his conscious mind had not retained, awareness of the passage of years and the gradual changes in the world around his frozen form. While some part of his consciousness remained aware of time's passage and the mounting cost of his preservation through avatar state, energy, the spiritual consultations that Aang sought from the wisest masters throughout the world provided perspectives that were thoughtful but ultimately limited by the unprecedented nature of his situation. No previous avatar having survived a century of suspended animation or faced the particular combination of factors that might be contributing to his current decline. The ancient texts that were consulted offered fragments of relevant information, but no comprehensive understanding of how the avatar state's life-preserving functions might exact delayed costs from someone who had been sustained through methods that exceeded normal human endurance. The gradual reduction of his public appearances and official duties was managed carefully to avoid creating alarm about his condition, while ensuring that essential functions continued to be fulfilled through other means and by other people, whose capabilities had been developed specifically to provide such continuity. The transition was delicate because Aang's presence had become so central to many international processes and institutions that sudden absence might create instability or uncertainty that could affect peace and cooperation that had been built through decades of patient work and careful relationship building. The family meetings that became more frequent during this period involved discussions about practical arrangements and emotional preparation for changes that everyone hoped would not be necessary, but that wisdom suggested should be anticipated and planned for in case Aang's condition continued to deteriorate. The conversations were difficult for everyone involved, requiring acknowledgement of mortality and limitation, while maintaining hope for recovery and the continuation of shared projects and relationships that had provided meaning and purpose for all their lives. The meditation retreats that Aang undertook at the various air temples during this period served multiple purposes, providing him with opportunities for deep spiritual practice, while also allowing him to spend extended time in places that had been central to his cultural identity and his work of preservation and restoration. The quiet months at the Southern Air Temple, where his childhood had been spent, offered connections to memories and experiences that predated all the responsibilities and challenges that had defined his adult life, creating space for reflection and acceptance that was essential for whatever transitions lay ahead. The writing that occupied much of his time during these retreats attempted to capture not only the technical knowledge and cultural information that future generations would need, but also the emotional and spiritual dimensions of Air Nomad, life that could not be preserved through formal instruction alone. The personal accounts that he created of his experiences growing up within a living culture before the genocide transformed him into the sole survivor, attempting to resurrect what had been lost, provided context and depth that would be essential for anyone trying to understand what they were being asked to preserve and continue. The correspondence that Aang maintained with friends and colleagues throughout the world during this period often carried undertones of farewell that he tried to keep subtle, while still ensuring that important things were said and appreciated, while opportunities for such communication remained available. The letters that he wrote to leaders who had worked with him over the decades expressed gratitude for their cooperation and partnership, while also offering final guidance and encouragement for continuing the work of building peace and justice that would need to continue regardless of his personal circumstances. The physical symptoms that became more pronounced as months passed included not only fatigue and coordination problems, but also episodes of confusion and memory difficulty that suggested the possibility of neurological changes that might be related to the unique stresses that his extended time in the Avatar state had placed on his brain and nervous system. The moments when he temporarily forgot where he was or failed to recognize familiar faces were frightening for everyone involved, while providing additional evidence that something fundamental was changing in his physical and mental condition. The spiritual experiences that occurred with increasing frequency during this period included visions of previous Avatar incarnations who seemed to be preparing him for transition, while also providing guidance about how to approach death and rebirth with a spiritual preparation that would ensure smooth continuation of the Avatar cycle. The conversations with Avatar Roku and other predecessors that took place during deep meditation offered perspectives on mortality and continuity that helped Aang understand his individual experience within the larger pattern of eternal service that transcended any single incarnation's lifespan or achievements. The acceptance that gradually developed during these months was not resignation, but rather mature recognition that all lives follow natural cycles of growth, service, and completion that could be embraced with dignity and grace when approached with proper spiritual preparation and emotional readiness. The fear that had initially accompanied his declining health gave way to curiosity about what lay beyond death, and confidence that the work he had been called to do during this incarnation had been accomplished as fully as circumstances and his individual capabilities had allowed. The moments of clarity that still occurred during this period provided opportunities for final teachings and blessings that carried weight precisely because they came from someone who was approaching the transition from life to whatever followed with spiritual preparation and emotional equanimity. The insights that Aang shared during these lucid intervals often concerned the eternal nature of consciousness and the importance of maintaining connection to spiritual sources of guidance and strength that transcended individual existence, while honoring the unique contributions that each person could make during their time of earthly service. The preparation for death that occupied Aang's attention during his final months involved both practical arrangements for the continuation of his work and spiritual practices designed to ensure that his consciousness would be ready for whatever transition awaited, while his accumulated wisdom and experience would be available to guide his next incarnation through the challenges that each avatar faced when discovering their identity and accepting their cosmic responsibilities. The meditation techniques that he practiced with increasing frequency were ancient methods for preparing consciousness for death and rebirth that had been preserved in air nomad texts, but had rarely been needed during the centuries when their practitioners could expect normal lifespans and natural deaths. As his physical condition continued to decline and the signs of approaching death became unmistakable to medical experts and spiritual advisors who had been monitoring his situation, Aang found himself experiencing profound peace and gratitude for the extraordinary life that he had been privileged to live, the relationships that had sustained him through impossible challenges, and the opportunity to serve purposes larger than individual happiness while still experiencing the personal joys and satisfactions that made existence meaningful, rather than merely dutiful obligation to cosmic forces beyond complete understanding or control. The spiritual journey that carried Aang beyond the boundaries of physical sensation and into communion with Avatar Roku began like countless meditation sessions before it, his consciousness settling into familiar patterns of breath and awareness, while his aging body found what comfort it could against the cushions that had supported decades of such practice on Air Temple Island. But the depth that he achieved during this particular session was unlike anything he had experienced since his youth. the barriers between individual identity and cosmic consciousness dissolving with an ease that suggested preparation for transitions that extended far beyond ordinary spiritual exploration. Avatar Roku's presence manifested not as vision or voice, but as complete understanding that flowed directly into Aang's awareness. The previous incarnation's knowledge and experience becoming temporarily accessible, without the usual filters of personality or perspective that normally separated one consciousness from another. The communication that took place transcended language entirely, operating through direct transmission of concepts and emotions that revealed truths about Aang's condition that no amount of medical examination or healer consultation had been able to diagnose or explain satisfactorily. The revelation that emerged from this spiritual communion was both devastating and liberating, providing answers to questions that had tormented Aang for months, while also confirming fears that he had tried to suppress about the ultimate consequences of his century-long preservation in the Avatar state. Roku's explanation unfolded with the clarity that comes from complete understanding, showing how the cosmic energy that had sustained life during those 100 years of ice had been borrowed rather than freely given, extracted from future vitality that would eventually need to be repaid, regardless of when or how such accounting took place. The Avatar state that had seemed like miraculous salvation during that desperate flight from the air temple had operated according to spiritual principles that required balance in all things, the preservation of life during the iceberg years having created debt against Aang's natural lifespan that compound interest had been accumulating throughout the decades since his awakening. The energy that should have sustained him into normal old age had been consumed during his suspended animation, leaving him with reserves that were already depleted by the time his apparent youth should have been giving way to middle age. The understanding that his body was aging at an accelerated rate that would eventually claim his life decades before his chronological years would suggest provided context for the symptoms that had been mystifying healers and causing increasing concern among family and friends who had watched his decline without comprehending its inexorable nature or spiritual foundations. The fatigue, confusion, and physical deterioration that had appeared to be illness or injury were actually the natural consequences of time catching up with someone whose preservation had violated the normal rhythms of existence in ways that cosmic forces would eventually need to correct. Roku's presence during this revelation was both compassionate and unflinching. The previous incarnation's own experience with mortality and the mistakes that had led to his early death, providing him with understanding of how individual avatar lives fit into patterns that extended across generations while serving purposes that transcended personal happiness or longevity. The guidance that he offered emphasized acceptance rather than resistance, spiritual preparation rather than futile attempts to forestall consequences that had been determined by choices made decades earlier during moments of crisis when survival had seemed more important than consideration of delayed costs. The conversation that unfolded during this extended spiritual communion covered not only the medical realities of Aang's situation, but also the broader implications for the Avatar cycle and the timing of his eventual rebirth into circumstances that would serve the world's needs during whatever challenges lay ahead. Roku's insights into the patterns that governed Avatar incarnation revealed how individual deaths and births were coordinated with historical circumstances in ways that ensured each lifetime would provide opportunities for the kind of service that cosmic balance required during particular periods of human development. The knowledge that his time was limited, but not immediately terminal, provided Aang with framework for making decisions about how to spend whatever months or years remained available to him. The understanding that death was approaching but not imminent, creating space for preparation that could serve both his personal needs for closure and completion, and the world's requirements for smooth transition to whatever avatar would follow. The relief that came from finally understanding his condition was accompanied by urgency about ensuring that essential tasks were completed while opportunities for such work remained. The practical implications of this spiritual diagnosis required careful consideration of how much information to share with family and colleagues whose emotional preparation for his death would need to be balanced against their ability to function effectively during whatever time remained for continued cooperation and shared projects. The conversations that would need to take place with Katara, their children, and the various leaders and institutions that depended on his guidance would require wisdom about timing and presentation that could help others accept inevitable loss while continuing their own important work. The decision about when and how to share this knowledge with Katara was perhaps the most difficult aspect of Aang's new understanding. His awareness that she deserved to know the truth about his condition, complicated by recognition that such information would cause her profound pain, while providing little opportunity for changing outcomes that had been determined by circumstances beyond anyone's current control. The love that had sustained their marriage through decades of Avatar responsibilities now required him to consider how honesty could serve her needs while preparing her for separation that would be permanent until the Avatar cycle brought them together again in some future incarnation. The gradual revelation of his situation to their children would need to be managed with even greater care. Tenzin's responsibilities for continuing air nomad traditions, requiring preparation that balanced emotional support with practical instruction, while Bumi and Kya deserved opportunities to say whatever farewells might be necessary, without being burdened by extended periods of anticipatory grief that could interfere with their own lives and relationships. The family dynamics that had sustained them through previous challenges would be tested by this ultimate crisis in ways that required strength and wisdom from everyone involved. The meditation practices that Aang undertook following his spiritual consultation with Roku were designed to prepare his consciousness for the transition from physical existence to whatever state would precede his next incarnation. The ancient techniques for managing death and rebirth, requiring dedication and concentration that became increasingly important as his physical condition continued to deteriorate. The breathing exercises and visualization methods that had been preserved in Air Nomad texts provided guidance for navigating the dissolution of individual identity while maintaining connection to the eternal aspect of consciousness that would continue across lifetimes. The writing that occupied much of his remaining energy during this period was focused on creating comprehensive records of everything that future generations would need to continue the work of preserving air nomad culture and maintaining the institutions that he had helped establish throughout his lifetime as Avatar. The urgency that drove this documentation effort was balanced by recognition that rushed or incomplete instruction would serve no one's interests, requiring him to balance thoroughness with the limitations imposed by his declining health and reduced capacity for sustained mental effort. The visits to the 4 air temples that Aang undertook during his final year provided opportunities for saying farewell to places that had been central to his identity and his work, while also ensuring that the restoration and preservation efforts that had occupied decades of his attention would continue under guidance that could function independently of his presence. The conversations with air acolytes and temple caretakers during these journeys covered both practical arrangements for ongoing operations and spiritual instruction that would help these dedicated practitioners maintain their commitment to air nomad principles and practices. The blessing ceremonies that Aang conducted at each temple were both celebration of what had been accomplished and preparation for continuation. Without his direct involvement, the the rituals drawing on traditional air nomad practices while adapting them for circumstances that the original culture could never have anticipated. The spiritual energy that he channeled during these events seemed to come from sources beyond his individual reserves, suggesting that cosmic forces were supporting his efforts to ensure smooth transitions for communities and institutions that would need to function after his death. The correspondence that he maintained with leaders throughout the world during this final period carried increasingly explicit messages of gratitude and farewell, while also providing final guidance about challenges and opportunities that would require attention in the years following his death. The letters that he wrote to Fire Lord Zuko, Earth King Hao Ting, and other officials who had worked with him over the decades expressed confidence in their ability to continue the work of building peace and justice, while acknowledging that such efforts would require ongoing dedication and cooperation that transcended individual leadership changes. The spiritual experiences that became more frequent and intense as his physical condition worsened provided Aang with increasing access to cosmic perspectives that helped him understand his individual life within the larger context of Avatar service and human history. The visions that came during deep meditation revealed patterns of continuity and change that extended across generations, while showing how each incarnation's contributions fit into purposes that served spiritual evolution and the gradual development of wisdom and compassion throughout the world. The peace that settled over Aang during his final months was not the absence of concern or sadness about leaving loved ones and unfinished work, but rather the deep tranquility that comes from accepting natural processes while trusting that larger forces would continue the essential work through whatever means proved necessary and effective. The spiritual preparation that had occupied increasing amounts of his time and energy was creating readiness for transition that encompassed both practical arrangements for those who would continue his work and internal preparation for whatever consciousness would experience beyond the boundaries of individual existence. The conversations with previous Avatar incarnations that occurred during his deepest meditative states provided reassurance that death was not ending but transformation, continuation of service in different form, rather than termination of connection to the work that had given his life meaning and purpose. The wisdom that emerged from these spiritual communications emphasized that each avatar's individual contributions became part of eternal accumulation of knowledge and experience that would guide future incarnations while serving the ongoing work of maintaining balance between spiritual and material worlds. As the final weeks of his life approached and his physical decline made continued activity increasingly difficult, Aang found himself experiencing gratitude that encompassed not only the extraordinary opportunities he had been given to serve purposes larger than individual happiness, but also the simple human joys and relationships that had provided meaning and satisfaction throughout decades of cosmic responsibility. The love of family and friends, the beauty of natural world, the satisfaction of work well done. These elements of ordinary human existence had been as important as avatar powers in creating a life that felt complete and worthy of the trust that spiritual forces had placed in his stewardship. The morning of Aang's final day dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that had always characterized Air Temple Island during the early hours when mist rose from the harbor and the first light touched the restored buildings with gentle warmth that seemed to bless everything it illuminated. The peace that had settled over the island during the previous weeks deepened into something approaching the sacred, as if the natural world itself recognized that momentous transition was approaching and had stilled its usual rhythms in respectful acknowledgement of the profound change that was about to occur. Katara's presence beside his bed was both comfort and anchor, her hand in his providing connection to the physical world, even as his consciousness began its gradual withdrawal from bodily sensation toward whatever lay beyond the boundaries of individual existence. The love that had sustained their marriage through decades of avatar responsibility and family joy now served as bridge between life and death, her strength supporting him through the final passages, while his peaceful acceptance helped her find courage to let go when the time came for such release. The children who gathered during these last hours brought with them the full weight of shared history and mutual affection that had been built through years of ordinary family moments, as well as extraordinary challenges that had tested everyone's capacity for resilience and adaptation. Tenzin's quiet presence carried the additional weight of his unique responsibilities as inheritor of air nomad traditions, his father's approaching death marking not only personal loss, but also the end of direct connection to pre-war cultural knowledge that would now depend entirely on what had been preserved and transmitted through their years of intensive instruction and practice. Bumi's tears were unashamed and healing, his expression of grief providing emotional release that honor and duty might otherwise have constrained, while his stories of childhood adventures and adult achievements created atmosphere of celebration rather than simple mourning. The son who had never developed bending abilities had nonetheless inherited the courage and compassion that were his father's truest legacies. His service to peace and justice through conventional means, demonstrating that avatar values could be expressed through any life dedicated to serving others rather than pursuing purely personal satisfaction or advancement. Kia's healing abilities had been exhausted in attempts to ease her father's physical discomfort during his final decline, but her presence during these last hours provided different kind of medicine through the emotional support and spiritual strength that flowed from her deep understanding of both air nomad philosophy and water tribe traditions about death and the continuation of consciousness beyond bodily existence. Her tears mixed gratitude with sorrow, acknowledging both the privilege of having such a father and the pain that came with losing someone whose influence had shaped every aspect of her development and worldview. The air acolytes who maintained vigil outside the family's private space represented the continuation of traditions that would persist beyond any individual's lifetime, their dedication to preserving and practicing air nomad culture, providing assurance that Aang's work of cultural restoration would continue under guidance that honored essential principles, while adapting to changing circumstances and evolving understanding. Their quiet chanting of traditional prayers created background music that supported the family's farewell rituals, while connecting the immediate experience to centuries of air nomad spiritual practice. The flying bison who had found sanctuary on Air Temple Island seemed to sense the approaching transition, their behavior becoming unusually subdued and gentle, as if they too understood that momentous change was occurring in the life of someone who had been their protector and advocate throughout the decades since the genocide that had nearly eliminated their species, along with the air nomads who had been their traditional partners in flight and friendship. Appa's presence was both blessing and farewell. The ancient bond between airbender and sky bison, providing comfort that transcended the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. The spiritual preparations that had occupied Aang's attention during his final weeks reached culmination in the meditation practices that carried his consciousness through the stages of dissolution that marked the transition from life to whatever state preceded rebirth into the next avatar, incarnation. The breathing techniques that had been fundamental to air nomad spiritual development served their ultimate purpose as tools for navigating death with awareness and dignity, rather than fear or confusion about processes that were natural, parts of existence when properly understood and accepted. The visions that came to Aang during his final hours included appearances by previous Avatar incarnations who had gathered to welcome him into the eternal community of consciousness that transcended individual lifetimes while preserving accumulated wisdom and experience that would guide future incarnations through their own periods of service and discovery. Avatar Roku's presence was strongest among these spiritual guides, his own experience of premature death, providing understanding and compassion that helped ease Aang's transition, while ensuring continuity of knowledge and purpose across the gap between incarnations. The words that Aang spoke during his final conscious moments were expressions of gratitude rather than regret. His acknowledgement of the extraordinary life he had been privileged to live, encompassing not only the dramatic achievements that would be remembered by history, but also the simple human joys of love, friendship, and daily contact with beauty that had provided meaning beyond any cosmic responsibilities or public recognition. His thanks extended to family and friends whose support had made everything else possible, to teachers and students who had shared in the work of preserving and transmitting wisdom, and to the spiritual forces that had guided him through challenges that no individual could have faced alone. The moment when breath ceased and heartbeat stilled was marked not by struggle or distress, but by profound peace that seemed to radiate outward from his physical form to encompass everyone present. The spiritual preparation that had occupied his final months, creating readiness for transition that transformed what might have been traumatic separation into something approaching celebration of completion and new beginning. The light that briefly illuminated his tattoos as the avatar state departed his body was visible confirmation that cosmic forces were facilitating smooth passage from one incarnation to the next. The immediate aftermath of Aang's death was characterized by stillness that allowed everyone present to process the magnitude of what had just occurred while beginning the emotional and practical adjustments that would be necessary for continuing life without someone who had been central to their individual and collective existence. The grief that began to emerge was complicated by awareness that death was not ending but transformation, continuation of service in different form, rather than termination of connection to work that had given meaning and purpose to multiple lifetimes of dedication. Katara's strength during these first hours after her husband's death drew on reserves that had been built through decades of facing impossible challenges together. Her ability to balance personal sorrow with practical necessities, providing leadership that helped family and associates begin the difficult process of adjustment to circumstances that would require new forms of cooperation and mutual support. The widow's dignity in grief became model for others who were struggling to understand how life could continue without someone whose presence had seemed essential for everything they valued. The rituals that surrounded Aang's death and the preparation of his body for final rites drew on both air nomad and water tribe traditions, creating ceremonies that honored his cultural heritage while acknowledging the multicultural family and community that had grown around him during his lifetime as Avatar. The blessing that was spoken over his physical form emphasized not loss but gratitude for the service he had provided, while expressing confidence that his essential spirit would continue its work through whatever incarnation followed. The news of Avatar Aang's death spread throughout the world with speed that reflected both the communication networks that had been developed during the decades of peace and the deep affection that people throughout the four nations felt for someone who had saved them from war while helping to build institutions and relationships that served everyone's interests rather than favoring any particular group or region. The tributes that began arriving at Air Temple Island demonstrated the breadth of influence that one person could have when dedicated to principles larger than personal advancement or recognition. The search for Aang's reincarnation began immediately, according to protocols that had been established by the White Lotus organization during previous Avatar transitions. The systematic investigation of children born at the time of his death providing hope that continuity of Avatar service would be maintained despite the grief and uncertainty that naturally accompanied such momentous change. The spiritual signs and practical tests that would eventually identify the new Avatar represented both ending and beginning, completion of one life's service and preparation for whatever challenges the next incarnation would be called to address. The discovery of Korra in the Southern Water Tribe within months of Aang's death provided confirmation that the Avatar cycle had continued according to patterns that transcended individual circumstances while adapting to whatever needs the world would face during the coming generation. The young waterbender's early demonstration of multiple element mastery suggested personality and capabilities that differed significantly from Aang's gentle approach, indicating that each Avatar incarnation brought unique gifts and perspectives that served specific historical circumstances and spiritual requirements. The memorial services that were held throughout the world during the year following Aang's death celebrated not only his individual achievements but also the collaborative efforts of everyone who had worked with him to build peace and preserve cultural wisdom that might otherwise have been lost forever. The speeches and tributes that characterized these gatherings emphasized continuation rather than conclusion, the ongoing work of maintaining justice and harmony that would require dedication from multiple generations rather than depending on any single individual's lifetime of service. The statue that was erected in Republic City to commemorate Aang's contributions to the founding and development of the United Republic represented artistic attempt to capture both the power and the gentleness that had characterized his approach to Avatar responsibilities. The sculpture's placement in the harbor, where ships from all four nations could see it, providing daily reminder of the principles and achievements that had made international cooperation possible, despite centuries of conflict and mistrust. The institutions that Aang had helped establish continued their work under guidance from people who had learned from his example while developing their own approaches to leadership and service. The air temples and air acolyte communities maintaining their dedication to preserving cultural wisdom while adapting practices to serve contemporary needs and circumstances that required evolution rather than simple repetition of traditional patterns. The family that survived him continued to embody the values and principles that had guided his life while pursuing their individual paths through careers and relationships that honored their shared heritage without being constrained by expectations that might have prevented authentic, personal development. The love that had sustained them through his lifetime remained strong enough to support whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead, providing foundation for lives that served others while finding personal meaning and satisfaction. The legacy that Aang left behind was measured not only in the dramatic achievements that would be remembered by historians, but also in the countless individual lives that had been touched by his example of compassion, wisdom, and dedication to principles that transcended personal interest or advantage. The peace that had been built through his efforts would require ongoing maintenance and development, but the foundations had been established strongly enough to support whatever structures future generations would choose to create in service of justice and mutual understanding between all peoples who shared the world that his lifetime of service had helped to heal and protect. As the immediate crisis of transition gave way to longer-term adaptation to circumstances that no longer included his direct presence and guidance, the people whose lives had been shaped by contact with Avatar Aang began to discover that his influence would continue through the principles and practices that they had learned from his example. The wisdom and compassion that had characterized his approach to every challenge, creating ongoing inspiration for work that would extend far beyond what any individual lifetime could accomplish independently. The legacy that Avatar Aang left behind extends far beyond the cities he helped build or the peace he brokered between nations that had known only war for 100 years. In every air acolyte who practices morning meditation as dawn breaks over Republic City, in every decision made with compassion over vengeance, in the very existence of a world where all four nations can live as neighbors rather than enemies, his spirit endures with quiet strength that requires no monuments or ceremonies to maintain its influence on hearts that choose understanding over conflict. Though his body succumbed to time's gentle passage at the age of 66, worn down by the century he had spent suspended between life and death while the world burned around his frozen form, his greatest teachings echo through generations like ripples spreading across still water. The wisdom that understanding transcends conflict, that preserving life matters more than ending it, that hope can survive even the darkest of times when people choose to kindle light rather than curse darkness. These truths live on in every choice made with love rather than fear. In Avatar Korra, his cycle continued, carrying forward not just cosmic power, but the accumulated wisdom of lifetimes dedicated to service. Not just the ability to bend elements, but the deeper strength to bend hearts toward justice and souls toward peace. As you drift toward restful slumber, remember that endings are also beginnings, that every sunset promises dawn, and that the most profound victories are won through the patient, persistent choice to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to love rather than fear. Rest well, knowing that somewhere in the eternal dance of seasons and souls, the Avatar's gentle spirit watches over all who seek balance in a world forever changed by one boy's decision to choose mercy over might.